I grew up as an immigrant kid. I lived in 2 cities in my life, Shanghai, China, where I was born, and Vancouver, Canada, where my family moved to when I was 9 years old. Through this big move, one thing really stuck with me: my bicultural identity crisis. I wanted to make this video because I wanted to share what it's really like growing up in 2 very different cultures and always struggling to see where you fit into the picture. And because I'm taking a cultural psychology course at school, and I thought it would be perfect to use some of those new knowledge to break down in specific psychology terms what it really means to grow up Asian Canadian. Now, I know everyone has a different relationship with their heritage, so things I say may or may not be relatable even for immigrants. I am simply sharing my story. I was born in Shanghai, China, and I grew up in the Huangpu district. At the time, China had the one-child policy, so right from the get-go, I didn't see family the same as someone from a Western country with a much larger family. Like, it was nothing like what it's seen on American television. The nuclear family was just me, my mom, and my dad. My parents were not the typical Asian parents because my dad actually received education in the West. So a lot of his values came from the West, unlike the stereotypical Asian tiger mom and dad who enforce strict rules, have little dialogue, and have little warmth toward their children. My parents always saw me as an independent person, while kids from other families were forced to study every day after school, in after-school classes, because those existed. I was pretty much able to do most things I wanted, given that I finished my homework, of course. I attended preschool and then elementary school in Shanghai up until grade 3. Now, elementary school in China is completely different from elementary school in Canada. Like, there was no recess, there were no teachers forcing you to go outside and play. We didn't sit at big tables or have like group social activities. We would sit in these individual desks as straight lines, and we were even told to hold this perfect sitting posture, which didn't really work, by the way. Like, I remember first seeing the elementary school classrooms in Canada where the younger grades were actually able to sit on the carpeted floor and listen to the teacher or even read. And I was like, excuse me? You had this the entire time? Culture shock. I think most important of all, though, academic performance was one thing that really dictated how popular you were in school and how much warmth you got at home. I remember there was this one time when one of my classmates, who wasn't very good at math, was called out to the front of a class, to the blackboard, to do a very basic math question. Like, he just stood there and he couldn't do it. And I remember our math teacher getting really mad that she took out this giant meter ruler stick, asked him to extend his hand out. She just started hitting him with the meter stick on the back of his hand. And he just started crying, like, in front of the whole class. And as he was crying, the teacher was still hitting him and yelling at him for being a bad student. Yeah, as a host class, we just sat there. Y'all, this was grade 2. Yeah, I never did bad at math after that. Now, that was more of an extreme case, but we were still in the kind of environment where we were conditioned to believe that grades were all that mattered. And a funny thing is, even if you did do really well on a test, like get an A, when you go home to show your parents, they would just be like, but did you know that Julie next door got an A+? And the teacher would be like, the test next week will be even harder, so you better work even harder. No matter what we achieved, there was always a constant upward social comparison, which means that our performance was constantly being compared to someone who is doing better. And there was always someone who was doing better. So the whole Asian kids are so smart stereotype thing Well, it came from this culture of constantly needing to show success and improvements. And this mentality really doesn't just apply to academics. We've been taught since young to avoid failures. In psychology, this is what's known as a prevention orientation. The prevention orientation is a general motivation to avoid failures and prevent losses, with a big emphasis on responsibility. People with a prevention orientation tends to be more scared to take risks in order to avoid negative outcomes. In contrast, a promotion orientation is the motivation to achieve success, with a big emphasis on aspiration and hope. Now, these two orientations sound like they can come together side by side, but what it really highlights is a difference in our approach to things. Promotion-oriented people prioritize achieving good things, while prevention-oriented people prioritize avoiding bad things. A good question to frame these two different approaches is, do you play to win, or do you play to not lose? Many studies have shown that in general, East Asians play to not lose, because culturally we've been taught that the negative consequences associated with failure is just much, much stronger than the positive consequences associated with success. It'll be interesting to think about whether you are a promotion-oriented person or a prevention-oriented person. I know I definitely fall into the prevention orientation just because culturally that's what we've been taught. My parents always told me, you don't need to be the best. You can be the second best or the third best or even the fourth best, but you cannot be below average, because below average is associated with failure, and you can't be a failure. But academic success or failure is not the only thing that I learned. China is a collectivistic society. It means that the culture emphasizes group goals more than individual person's needs. Through this kind of mentality, I adopted what's called an interdependent view of self. Okay, that's a lot of new words, I know. First, what is self? Well, the concept of self is how we perceive ourselves and our identity, and it really affects how we think and approach things. An interdependent view of self emphasizes your role in a network of social relationships. So in a collectivistic society like China, most people have an interdependent view. The culture emphasizes group goals, so it was never about you as one individual person. It was always about your role in the greater society. So for example, you can identify as a student of Beijing University, for example. Your identity or your idea of self is very much tied to that role as a student embodying and representing Beijing University. I remember when I had conversations with Europeans or Americans about Asian representation, and some of the most common things I hear are, why does it matter so much if you're Asian? What does your heritage have to do with who you are? You are your own unique person, and you don't need no heritage to tell you who you can be. Okay, Susan, take a back seat and realize that there are people out there in this world that do not see the world and think in the same way that you do. Thing is, most Westerners grow up with an independent view of self. So their identity is largely independent of others. They tend to focus on individual accomplishments and their own unique traits. When it comes to something big like finding happiness, it was always about what makes me happy as a person rather than what makes us happy as a collective. So you might think, well, that mindset is easily interchangeable. Maybe you should just start thinking about me more instead of us, or us more instead of me. You know what? It turns out that these two concepts can actually be linked to different brain activation patterns. This self concept is not just theory. It's actually physiologically rooted in us. So you can't just tell somebody, stop thinking so much about what other people think of you. Stop thinking so much about yourself. Because it's been wired into us. Okay, I talked a lot about my experiences growing up in China and what those experiences translate to in terms of psychology terms. But what about when I moved to Canada? What did I learn? How was that cultural shift? In December of 2007, my family packed our bags, flew across the Pacific Ocean, and landed right here in Richmond, BC. I remember just being so excited to go overseas for some reason. Like I would tell all my friends, oh, you won't ever see me again because I'm going overseas. Like that was really cool or something. Like I definitely did not know what I was getting myself into. I did not speak a word of English. You would think that doing really well in English class in school means that you would actually understand something. But no, absolutely not. I remember it being really cold and rainy and not understanding anything around me, but I was still really excited. I think it's just like the freshness of something new. I was still in the honeymoon stage of embracing a new culture, a new country. And it honestly didn't really hit me until I had to go to school. And then I realized, wow, I don't fit in. Though I have to say, out of all the cities in North America, Richmond is definitely a city you can move to and still feel like you're in Asia. Like, come on, the Chinese population is over 50%. So I know compared to some of my friends who actually grew up in a more white neighborhood, I definitely had an easier time adjusting. But I definitely still felt foreign and different. And this difference only continued to be more apparent the longer I went to school for. Even though my English got better and better and I was able to communicate with everybody, something still felt different. The way that people would think was just different. Like I honestly couldn't even tell you what it was that I felt was different. But now that I'm actually studying more psychology, I can actually reflect on those experiences and break down what it was that was the difference. So I talked about how Asians generally have a more group identity where they emphasize on relationships and their roles rather than individuality. Well, when I moved to Canada, I learned more and more about the concept of individuals, just single people, single objects, single things, components that would make up a whole picture. This is what's called an analytic thinking style, where you focus on individual objects and their attributes rather than this whole picture. So on the other side, we have a holistic thinking style where you focus on relationships between objects and heavily talk about, context and the bigger picture. So in general, Westerners use more analytic thinking and Easterners use more holistic thinking. Again, this ties back to the whole collectivistic versus individualistic society thing. So for example, if you ask an analytic thinker and a holistic thinker to describe a dining table, an analytic thinker might say, oh, it's made out of wood and it has 4 legs. Whereas a holistic thinker might say, it's a place where people gather to eat. Of course, you can have a combination of those two different perspectives. Culturally speaking, Asians just tend to see the picture in its larger context, whereas Westerners tend to see the individual parts that make up that whole picture. Honestly, this is mostly subconscious. Like, most people aren't even aware that they're thinking a certain way until you tell them to think a certain way. These days though, I do find myself being more aware in the way that I think, in the way that I approach things. And you know what? This isn't the only thing that I've become conscious of. I know as I'm adapting more and more to Western culture and Western thinking, I began seeing myself more in almost first-person perspective rather than a third-person perspective. I know you're probably like, wait, you can see yourself in the third-person perspective? How does that happen? Okay, let's do an experiment. Think of a vivid memory you have from school or from work. Maybe your graduation or first day at work. Now really focus on the imagery of that memory. What do you see? Do you see the principal in front of you as you walk across the stage? Or maybe seeing your manager for the first time? Or perhaps you see yourself walking across the stage during the graduation ceremony. If you see yourself from the outside in, like almost you're in the seat of an audience, that's called a third-person memory. In contrast, if you more often see the world from the inside out rather than yourself from the outside in, that's called a first-person memory. It turns out that Easterners generally have a third-person perspective, while Westerners tend to have a first-person perspective. So while Americans tend to think in I's, like I walked across the stage, Easterners actually think more in me. They watch me walk across the stage. And this is actually why Asians just tend to always be aware of what other people think of them. like almost too much. Super interesting, right? Now imagine trying to get those two different perspectives to combine. Pretty damn difficult. That is basically my bicultural identity crisis. Over the years of growing up in Vancouver, I found myself identifying more and more as a Canadian. And I was doing a pretty good job of adapting and understanding the local culture. You know, I actually thought I fit in for once. But then life comes around and hits you hard with the identity denial. What is identity denial? This is identity denial.
Hi! Where are you from?
Oh, I'm from Vancouver, Canada.
No, I mean, like, I don't want to be assuming, like, you know, like, where are you actually from? Oh, you got me. I'm actually from Richmond, which is technically not part of Vancouver, but I just call it Vancouver because it's part of Metro Vancouver area.
I mean,
where are your parents from?
Why do you want to know where my parents are from?
Okay, fine. Where are you born?
Oh, I was born in Shanghai, China.
Yep. I knew it. Yeah, makes so much sense now. Yeah, I knew it. Cool. Konnichiwa.
That's not even the right language. I know many immigrants that have experienced this. And the thing is, subconsciously, because we're always denied being a Canadian or Australian or American, that many of us start to overcompensate. We start embracing the Western culture extra hard by watching more American TV shows, listening to more American music, you know, only eating Western food, and rejecting Asian culture completely, just to prove to the society that we belong. For the longest time, I shut away my Chinese heritage culture because I felt that in order for me to be accepted as a Canadian, I couldn't face those roots. It took years and years of understanding my own values and seeing growth in other people that I was finally able to face my own Chinese heritage culture and start integrating that with my Western side. Though oftentimes those perspectives would highly conflict. Like I would feel too Western for my Asian friends or too Asian for my Western friends. I can tell that the way that I see the world now is kind of a blend of two different perspectives. One influenced by Chinese culture and one influenced by Canadian culture. Sometimes though, it's less of a blend, it's more of a switch. I would see things through my Asian lens and then I would see things through my Western lens. This is pretty evident with my use of language sometimes. Sometimes I'll be thinking about something and then all of a sudden 就突然想起来个什么东西，然后就不知道什么时候 switch 这个 thinking， 然后到最后 it's like 我什么时候 inner dialogue 变成中文了？ Like, you don't do that? Does anyone else do that? Just randomly start thinking in a different language? This is actually what's known as frame switching. So you literally switch between frames. Like, you have like an Asian frame and you have a Western frame. For me, that, you know, happens sometimes, not all the time. I know some of my other friends also do that. I'm honestly blessed to have friends who have very similar cultural backgrounds. For the most part of my teen years and my 20s, I had people around me who could really relate to these struggles. It really made me feel not so alone in this. So thank you, Canada, for being the multicultural salad bowl that you are. I know this bicultural identity crisis of mine will not go away anytime soon and will probably stay with me for the rest of my life. But I wouldn't take back my Chinese roots for anything, and I wouldn't erase my Canadian side for anything. I have accepted that this is just who I am, and I am honestly really proud of that. Whew, that was a lot of information at once. I know I talked a lot about different traits generally associated with East Asian culture and then Western culture, but you also do need to recognize that at the end of the day, culture is constantly evolving. In this day and age, new ideas spread insanely fast, and with the ability to get information just like that and be able to travel physically to most places around the world, culture is no longer a static thing that's associated with just one physical place. You can have dozens and dozens of cultures in one place. Just look at New York City. But ultimately, you can attribute some of the differences in our perspectives of the world to the difference in upbringing in our cultural environment. I hope that you were able to learn something about your own culture or other people's culture through this video. I highly recommend talking to a friend from a foreign culture and just asking them what their cultural upbringing was like and see how different that was from your cultural upbringing. And ask them, how do they think culture has shaped who they are today? And tell me, like, how do you think culture has shaped who you are today? Thank you so much for watching. This has been a really rewarding experience, just being able to reflect back on my childhood and break down in specific psychology terms what my cultural upbringing was like. This is Cindy. Come back again if you want to learn something new about the world or just about yourself. I'll see you again next time.